One of the things that has happened, and I did predict this, with the Dems having, being a minority party in the House, it has allowed new names to come through and just establish themselves very, very quickly. Sheer dynamic. I mean, Stacey, I forgot.
Y'all spin, spin, spin. I don't know how y'all are still standing right now, because you should be quite dizzy from all the spinning that you're constantly doing when it comes to spinning the truth. You talk about free and fair elections, but you back a guy who we know tried to steal the election. And this isn't about what Democrats have to say. Let me remind you, for those of you that don't know how the justice system works, it's not a matter of the president went in and indicted Trump, but we are talking about grand juries. Grand juries are comprised of American citizens, and the people that have entered pleas of guilty that will be flipping on your leader in a minute, they are Republicans. I do want to point that out. And half of them were Republicans that were handpicked by Donald Trump himself. So, to be clear, whatever happens to your little leader, it's going to be because of the actions that he took. So you can talk all you want to about how January 6th was nonsense, but all of y'all were running at that time. Y'all were grabbing y'all's gas masks and y'all were running to your offices because you didn't know if they were coming to kill you. You should have cared that somebody was there to protect you, but instead you want to play games because you found out that it was your leader that decided that he wanted to propagate an insurrection on our country. So don't tell me that you care about the Constitution, because you don't. All you care about is Trump getting reelected, and I'll yield the last of my time to my leader. President of the United States has committed. But when we start talking about things that look like evidence, they want to act like they blind. They don't know what this is. These are our national secrets. Looks like in the shitter to me. This looks like more evidence of our national secrets, say on a stage at Mar-a-Lago. When we're talking about somebody that's committed high crimes, it's at least indictments. Let's say 32 counts related to unauthorized retention of national security secrets, 7 counts related to obstructing the investigation, 3 false statements, 1 count of conspiracy to defraud the United States, falsifying business records, conspiracy to defraud the United States, 2 counts related to efforts to obstruct the vote certification proceedings, 1 count of conspiracy to violate civil rights, 23 counts related to forgery or false document statements, 8 counts related to soliciting, and I could go on because he's got 91 counts pending right now. But I will tell you what the president has been guilty of. He has unfortunately been guilty of loving his child unconditionally, and that is the only evidence that they have brought forward. And honestly, I hope and pray that my parents love me half as much as he loves his child. Until they find some evidence, we need to get back to the people's work, which means keeping this government open so that people don't go hungry in the streets of the United States. And I will yield.
Let's just say the Senate, for whatever reason, decided to do H.R. 2 and send that right back to the House. Would Republicans vote for that?
No, absolutely not, because their leader has told them that they can't do it. You know, I thought that we lived in a country in which we had a democracy and we had 3 co-equal branches of government. But right now, it is clear that we have a leader over the legislative Republicans, and that leader isn't even an elected official. This is what we're dealing with. So when people want to blame Democrats when they head to the polls in November, the Republicans are saying that's exactly what we want you to do. But the reality is that Democrats have been the ones that have always been the adults in the room, especially this session, that have said, listen, we understand what it means to govern. That means that we don't necessarily get everything that we want, but we want to make sure that we are making some sort of progress and we're bettering the lives of American people. So we are always willing and ready to work. They are not. This is why this is the most unproductive Congress that we have had in modern day history. And I do want to pick up on a point that I don't think that we're emphasizing enough. This is the pro-Putin caucus. Full stop. That's what they are. And the fact that we have people that are agreeing to and allowing a dictator like Putin to do the things that are absolutely in opposition to democracy tells you how far we have come in this country. And it also tells you of the threat that we have in this country as it relates to democracy, because they are failing to respect the very principles that this country allegedly was built upon.
You know, and Stuart, part of what they are now saying they are going to do, their proactive sort of action, is to try to impeach Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas. They're going to do that. But it seems that the Republican parties are sort of trapped between the two things they want most, right? Whatever Donald Trump wants, which is for Putin to win, and the border to, I guess, I don't know, to be the spark of a civil war. It's not clear if there's a policy they want other than Putin winning and, I guess, a civil war.
Chair recognizes Ms. Crockett from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I don't know that I can get through all that I need to say in 5 minutes, but I'm going to do my best. We're going to start off with sexual abuse. I am so excited that my colleagues across the aisle care about sexual abuse, considering that the front runner right now for, presidency is kind of just been found liable of sexual abuse. So I'm excited because this may mean that finally some folk will back off from supporting him because we don't support sexual abusers in this chamber. So I'm happy about this. But let's talk about facts versus fiction. My Republican colleagues want to talk about being tough on crime and keeping criminals off the streets. And so we've talked about, let's talk about what is criminal. We've got members of Congress elected in other states, other cities, trying to subvert democracy and the will of the people of D.C. by dictating that the city act in a way the Republicans want because they think they know what's best. Republicans want to subvert the people's power, and it's not just for D.C., it's all over. We see this in states like Texas and North Carolina with gerrymandering. In fact, we still have members here who still think that Trump won in 2020. Republicans want to talk about crime and violence, but they don't want to admit their role in this crisis. The fact is that they still allow assault weapons in the hands of radical right extremists, which have forced families visiting a mall in my state of Texas to leave a mall with nothing more than trauma, hurt, and despair as a neo-Nazi terrorized them. And yet, what did they have in their hand? Another AR-15, but we don't want to have a conversation about that. So if we're going to talk about crime and the reasons for the increase in them, we've got to talk about these root causes. Number one, the fact that we have elected legislators that won't do their job and protect people by keeping these weapons off the streets. That's number one. Number two, we are still reeling from a financial crisis, and guess what? They don't want to make it better. I'm sure they all campaigned and said, oh, we're going to help out the economy post-COVID. But right now we are on a cliff over the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling that was raised 3 times under Trump, and 25% of this credit card bill that they don't want to pay was accrued under Trump, and he only had 1 term. And hopefully he won't have no more. Nevertheless, I digress. Let me move on. So let's also talk about the fact that just recently, I think it was yesterday or 2 days ago, we received reports that there is a staff member who's working for a Republican on this committee who has ties with and supports a white nationalist who has proclaimed himself to be just like Hitler. I don't really know what to say, except for the fact that this is a farce, all right? Because the fact is, we've got an increase in crime all over. If we really want to be real about it, let's talk about it. We're talking about D.C. right now, but the murder rates in red states like Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama have statistically exceeded those in blue states like Illinois, New Mexico, and Michigan every year since 2000. But since my colleagues feel the need to meddle in local affairs of D.C., then let's look at where there might be issues. To be clear, D.C. doesn't control most of its own post-arrest criminal justice system. Instead, the federal government administers most of it. So I have a few questions, yes or no, for you, Mayor Bowser. The federal government, not D.C., has the authority to prosecute nearly all crimes committed by adults under D.C. law.
That's correct.
The federal government appoints judges to the local D.C. courts.
That's correct.
The federal government has jurisdiction over community supervision and adults charged or convicted of D.C. crimes.
That's correct.
The federal government has jurisdiction over the incarceration of adults convicted of felonies under D.C. law.
Correct.
Lastly, Mayor Bowser, isn't the federal government responsible for parole and supervised release of people convicted of felonies under D.C. law?
Yes.
Thank you. The fact is, my Republican colleagues want to talk about keeping D.C. streets crime-free. They can't even keep the halls of Congress crime-free, because we gonna talk about this, because I got 24 seconds. My freshman colleague has just been indicted on 13 counts, 13 felony counts, right? But have they exhibited any courage to say, you know what, we will disallow this in our body. We will make sure that we expel this individual. They have not. So what I don't want to hear is that they care about crime, because if they did, they would start by cleaning up our own house and mind our own business instead of coming after DC. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
And Ms. Crockett is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pick up right where Representative Connolly left off. Out of curiosity, do either one of you know the definition of insanity?
I think you're referring to doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
Oh, okay. That's exactly what I was referring to. And it sounds like that is what this party is good at. But I want to talk about the theme of the day. Commissioner, you have said over and over and over the word complicated. I was not keeping a tally, but you said it a lot. So I want to work with this word a little bit. I have a list of items. I would like for you to let me know if you believe they are complicated or not. Tax returns.
Complicated.
Operating the IRS without proper investment.
Complicated.
Recruiting workers in this antagonistic environment.
Complicated.
Auditing millionaires and billionaires.
Complicated.
Okay, so it sounds like you've got a complicated job.
I do.
And it also sounds like you have to know something about math. My colleague brought that up as well. It sounds like you need to be at least somewhat decent at counting to be with IRS. Yes?
Yes.
You'd agree? Okay.
I agree.
You know, it's so weird because my colleagues on the other side of the aisle wanted to call this hearing. This is not our first. It's not our second. I've actually lost count myself of how many IRS hearings we're having. And they seemingly feel like they can fix your very complicated issues. But somehow they aren't good at simple math that would get them to a speaker, you know, right. So we've been 3 weeks without one. Let me ask you another question that may be another one of these when the math ain't math in situations. There was a looming government shutdown a few weeks ago. And interestingly enough, when I do the math, approximately a little bit more than 60% of the people that sit on this committee actually voted to shut us down. Now, out of curiosity, for everyone that claims to care about their constituents, do you think it's easier or more difficult to operate as the IRS when, say, there's a shutdown?
It is very disruptive to our operations.
Very disruptive. Let me give you another number that is very concerning to me. That number is 24. 24 represents the number of days that we have before the continuing resolution that 60% of, and when I say my colleagues, I'm talking about across the aisle, not on this side. We were about at 100%. Actually, we were 100% on this committee that voted to make sure that the government did not shut down. But if in 24 days, we don't have a speaker because they can't figure out their math, and we shut down, is that going to help you answer more phone calls or less phone calls?
A lot less.
Oh, okay. All right. So it sounds like we have a lot of performative politics that is taking place, because yet another number that was mentioned, and I believe you brought this number up, was $540 billion. You also talked about appropriations, and you talked about the fact, and I want to be clear about this $540 billion. This $540 billion is a net number, correct? This is not a net zero, like it's going to cost $540 to go get it, and that's how much we're going to get. We're talking about netting $540 billion, correct?
$540 billion. I would say we're on track under current course and speed to get about 70 back, so our hope is we'll be at 470. But yeah, it's $470 billion, which is what's owed versus what's paid.
Okay, very good. How is it that the American people should believe that the majority party has the ability to solve your complex issues
when, number one, they don't pay attention to history, which was defunding this organization has not helped their constituents, but hurt their constituents. And let me add to that. The last time I checked, America is growing. So you were defunding your organization as we were ending up with more people, which means that you have more work, correct?
Correct. More population, more filers, more changes to the tax code, and more complexity in how the economy operates. 2010, when our budget reduction started, we never heard of PayPal, Venmo, all these, payment platforms. The gig economy changes, and it's great, but we have to invest and be ready to be effective tax administrators as the world changes. That's why it's important to keep our funding at pace.
I agree, and as the child of an IRS worker, I absolutely want to thank you for what you do, and obviously, I always must send love to my mama. I thank her for what she does for the American people as well. I'll yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back her time. The distinguished gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Timmons, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been over a month since the House Oversight Committee launched our impeachment inquiry.
I come in this committee, and just when I think I can't be shocked anymore, I get shocked to the next level. And I listened to Dan, who I was with him in Israel in August, and I listened to him tell very real stories of real issues that are taking place in this world right now, issues that we have been charged with the responsibility of being the adults in the room and trying to solve. And as I listened to him, I thought, man, I was actually going to deal with what we're supposed to be talking about. And then, of course, I get a colleague from the other side of the aisle who could hear of the pain and suffering as Dan was telling the stories, and the only thing that he heard, because it's seemingly what happens in this chamber, is that there's a level of callousness and a lack of humanity a lot of times. We say the words, we care about the American people, but then the actions don't line up with caring about the American people. And so after hearing that story, the only thing that my colleague heard was about made-up evidence as it relates to the former president, the twice impeached, 91 indicted count former president who's currently sitting in a fraud trial, who's also been found liable of sexual assault. The only thing that he heard was this bit about made-up evidence. And so he says, well, the Democrats didn't have the right to do what they did when they impeached the president. I disagree. And it looks like at least 4 grand juries feel like they've got some evidence, or maybe that's made up as well. Or maybe once the convictions come down, which there will be a conviction in some territory, I say that with all confidence as someone who was practicing law for 17 years. I'm sure they will say that that was made up. I'm sure that they don't believe the co-defendants that have come out and pled guilty as it relates to the charges in Georgia, and I'm sure they think that that's made up. Just like they said that January 6th was made up after they ran for their lives. And I'm sure that they believe that the convictions that came out of January 6th, those were made up too. But let me tell you what's not made up as they live in their fairy tale world. What's not made up is that the government has a looming shutdown in 3 days, and they decided to drag you in and talk about the job that you're not doing. And before I go into it, I do appreciate the work that you do, especially as a girl that grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and fondly remembers the better days of Missouri when your father was the governor. So I will tell you what is not made up and what is real life. Number one, I want to recenter us on what it is your job is. Your job ain't got nothing to do with telework last time I checked. Is that true or not?
That's correct.
Okay, all right, because I don't know how the American people are going to get this straight when the members of Congress can't really figure out what your job is. So that's not your job. But you deal with a lot of real estate. So I just want to zone in on that because I don't have too much time left. But for those that don't understand, there's government leases, and most commercial leases go for more than a year, say, right?
Yes.
Yeah, usually more than maybe even 2 years, right?
Yes.
Usually a commercial lease is a very long-term lease, correct?
And the price usually goes down the longer the term.
Absolutely. So typically you're inclined to sign a longer lease, all right? But none of us saw COVID-19 happening. And while we are centered on talking about telework, it is really important that we zone in on something that you've said over and over and people are ignoring you. You said what makes it difficult for you to do your job is a lack of certainty. And this government shutdown, this is the second one just this year that we're running up on, and we're kicking the can down the road because we're gonna run up on another one in January. It looks like we're gonna run up on 2 now, January and February, if they can get this passed. Can you please explain why a lack of certainty has a negative impact on you doing what you are charged to do for the American people?
Yeah, thanks for that question. You know, real estate is a long-term thing. When you're buying a house or you're buying a piece of property, you don't just do that overnight. You have to plan your finances to make sure that it works. And when it comes to the federal government, it's not different. We have to have, particularly when we're maintaining buildings, we have to have a plan. We've got the biggest commercial real estate portfolio in the country. They're all in a different state of need, and we need to be able to have plans to address those things. And the only way you do that is with some certainty. And not having clarity about what a budget's going to be and kicking the can down to the road to the next year doesn't make the cost go down. It makes the cost go up. And so we've seen that happen over and over again because, again, of this lack of funding of the Federal Buildings Fund.
And you know what? To be clear, I remember when we had the first government shutdown looming, and we all have our own leases for our properties as well. I had to call my property manager and say, because the federal government can't get their stuff together, just so you know, I may not be able to pay my bills, and I hope you don't kick me out. That's not any way that we should be governing and talking about the fact that we are actually being fiscally responsible, because it's just the opposite of it. Thank you so much for your dedication to this country. I really appreciate your time and for you putting up with the antics.
Would the gentlelady yield to a question? Fine.